For part 2 of the Getting Started series, I'd like to talk a little bit about a book, the book of the Bible. So what is the Bible, all right? So the Bible is a book that was written over a period of 1,600 years by 40 different authors that all points to one story. That's the story of Christ. Now, it's not always evident when you're reading in the Old Testament how it points to Christ, but there are some great videos out there. The Bible Project on YouTube is a phenomenal resource on figuring out how it points to Christ, how it ties into the big picture. But the New Testament's a lot more obvious, but they all point to Christ. Now, as I just mentioned, the Old Testament, you might not know what that is. So the Bible itself is comprised of 66 different books. It is separated into two sections called the Old Testament and the New Testament. Old Testament has 39 books. The New Testament has 27 books. The Old Testament is more history. It talks about God and God's impact and how he separated the Israelites from the rest of the people. The New Testament is very specifically talking about Jesus, his commands, and how we should use those and how we should behave. So we'll go into a little more detail about how those are broken up. I do want to say that the Bible is not organized chronologically, not organized in the way the events happen, not organized in the way that it was written. It is separated into groups, all right? So the first 5 books of the Bible, the Old Testament is first 5 books of the Bible, also known as the Torah or the Pentateuch. That's Genesis through Deuteronomy. Those are considered the books of the law. So this is when it tells a little bit of the story of God raising up the Israelites and pulling them out of captivity, and then he gives them the law. All right, so he gives them all the rules that they have to follow for the rest of the Old Testament, and even in the New Testament, you see hints of this coming in. Now, the next 12 books are called the books of history. These are the books Job through Esther. Now, an interesting fact, Job is considered to be the oldest book of the Bible, and again, like I said, it's not the first book. It's not written chronologically. After the books of history, you have the 5 books of poetry, which are Psalm through Song of Solomon. After that, you have what's considered the major prophets. So it's another 5 books. This is Isaiah through Daniel. Now, they're considered the major prophets, not because they are super great, but strictly because the size of the book. There's a lot more content in those books, all right? The next 12 books, the final 12 books of the Old Testament, are considered the minor prophets. So again, this is not because they're less important, it's just because the books are smaller. Those are Hosea through Malachi. Now, an important story you may have heard, again, minor prophets, but one you might have heard, is actually the story of Jonah and the whale. That is in the minor prophets. I should say the fish. It does not say if it's actually a whale or not. Jonah and the fish. Now we get to the New Testament. Again, the New Testament talks about the life of Jesus and who he actually is, what he did, what he taught, and then kind of how we should run with that. It's broken up into a few sections as well. The first 4 books of the Bible are considered the Gospels. These are 4 different ways to 4 different audiences by 4 different authors that tell about the life of Jesus. Some start very early, like at the birth of Jesus. Some don't start at the birth, but continue on through the life of him. And they all end at the death and ascension of Jesus Christ. The next book of the Bible is Acts. The next section is the book of Acts. And it is the introduction to a man named Paul, who's a very important character in Christian history, and gives a detail about the very early beginnings of the Christian church. After that, we have the Pauline epistles. There are 13 Pauline epistles. I just mentioned this guy named Paul. Paul wrote 13 letters to different churches in the area. So let's say the book is Ephesus. That's a letter to the church the letters Ephesians. That's a letter to the church of Ephesus. Corinthians, letter to the church of Corinth. Every single one of these are a letter to people. Romans, letter to the church in Rome. These books are Romans through Philemon. So Philemon is not a letter to a church, it's a letter to a slave owner named Onesimus, who owns Philemon. Philemon runs away, wants to come back. Those are the Pauline epistles. After that, you have kind of general letters to the church. This is Hebrews through Jude. There's 8 books there. And then you have prophecy, which is Revelation. That book has a lot in it. I do not recommend, if you've never read the Bible, that you start in Revelation. So it's a challenging book to read and to understand sometimes, but it does talk about kind of the end of days and some visions that a man named John, who wrote the book of John, one of his disciples did, some visions that he saw near the end of his life. So with that being said, where do you get started? Let's say you really want to start reading the Bible. Where do you start? A lot of people want to read cover to cover. And that is great, and I encourage you to read the Bible. There's a lot of great reading plans for reading it in a year. I do not encourage you to read it cover to cover, from the front to the back though, especially if it's your first time reading. The books of the law, the books of history are repetitive and they are dull. And it will take a lot of determination to get through it. And if you actually get through it all, you'll be very bored and disinterested. I highly encourage you to start in one of the Gospels. I think they're all very important, equally as important. But the book of John is the one I recommend. Why the book of John? The book of John really centers in on the life of Jesus, what he does, his parables, and his teachings. The book of life really emphasizes the holiness. The book of John really emphasizes the holiness of the life of Jesus. And I think that's just a really good starting point. After the book of John, I would recommend the book of Acts to see how the early church started. Maybe a couple Pauline epistles. The book of James has some really good, it's a short book, only 5 chapters, really good information that's very practical to today. Then I would recommend you kind of go back and you start reading in the Old Testament. Genesis, kind of the intro of the world. You talk about some really important stories. Abraham, Isaac, Joseph. Joshua is a good book on separating the people. You know, there's a lot of good reading plans out there that I recommend. But definitely recommend, once you kind of get through maybe one of the Gospels, 2 of the Gospels, read the book of Acts, Romans, a few of those books. Then you can start going back to the Old Testament and looking. So, as always, if you guys have any questions about this video, have any questions about where to get started, any encouragement that you'd like, feel free to send me a message, post a comment, anything. Love to hear back from you. Love to help you out in any way I can.